Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 180 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I'm happy to welcome Ronald Andring Sr. as a guest to the Forge of Freedom. Ronald Andring is a member of the NRA, and we actually just met at the NRA annual meeting in Atlanta. And I would consider Ronald to be one of the most informed, if not the most informed, members of the NRA, at least outside of the board of directors, just an ordinary member, and maybe even including the board of directors. I'm not sure, but very informed, very engaged, was very active, not only in trying to reform the NRA through resolutions, was also participated in the trial in New York as I believe the only member to testify at the trial in New York. Has also proposed a number of resolutions and engaged with a number of the board members in trying to push for reform of the NRA. So with all that said, Ron, welcome to the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for having me.
Ron, at the beginning here, I want to give you an opportunity to tell the audience a little bit about yourself, and then also how you got engaged with the NRA and how you came to be so engaged in the efforts to reform the NRA.
Well, I've been involved in shooting since I was maybe 8, 9 years old. My father taught me how to shoot. We went to scout camp and we learned safety rules, and then I began hunting when I was 15 with my dad and with several of my friends. And then in 75, I started a career in law enforcement with the Washington State Patrol. And over the years, eventually that evolved to working 27 years at the Washington State Penitentiary, where I handled firearms not only as a personal endeavor, but also as part of my career. I think I first joined the NRA somewhere in the early 80s, but my membership lapsed at some point as I was busy with a lot of professional things and raising a family and involved in a lot of different activities. And over the years, I rejoined and dropped and rejoined and dropped. But finally, when I retired in 2005, I turned my attention to the NRA, and I joined and eventually became a life member, then upped it to endowment, and then currently patron. And I was intending to become a benefactor member when all of the nonsense broke in the media about what was happening with Wayne LaPierre and a lot of his cronies on the board. So I stopped contributing. I canceled my monthly contribution to ILA and basically began digging into what was really going on. Over the years, I tried to get answers from several board members, the old guard board members, and the officers of the association. And their pat answer was, "We can't talk about it, but you wait until the trial's over and all kinds of things will come out." That was how they deflected any kind of questioning or criticism of what they were doing. And then finally, when I retired in 2023, I had plenty of extra time to start really, really digging. So I discovered the archive for the New York AG versus NRA case in New York. And I began reading things that absolutely horrified me, made me extremely angry. And the more I read, the angrier I became. Over the time, I read the entire Attorney General's amended complaint, which laid out its case. I also read the nearly 5,000 pages of the trial transcript, the jury trial. I also read the nearly 4,000 pages of the bench trial. I read numerous depositions. I looked at documents, and it clearly painted a picture where over the last 25 or so years, Wayne LaPierre used his position as executive vice president and CEO to create contracts with board members, contracts that paid them anywhere from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. And this created a very tight group of directors on the board who were his defenders. They not only engaged in promoting him as executive vice president and turning a blind eye to what he was doing, but they also engaged in a conspiracy to manipulate the nominating and election processes to make sure that to the degree they could, only Wayne LaPierre supporters were elected to the board. Other directors had gone through the petition nomination process, and so they got on the board despite the uh, manipulated nominating process. And when they started calling for Wayne's resignation, when they asked for audits and investigations, this group of directors engaged in a conspiracy to retaliate against those directors, to strip them of their committee assignments, to ostracize them within the board, and do what they could to drive them off the board, either by not renominating them when they were up for renomination, or by forcing them to resign.
So I assume that you mentioned you found out about this through the media and these improper actions that were being taken by Wayne LaPierre and other people within or without the NRA, other contractors associated with the NRA. I assume, was that in 2019? That's about when I found out about all these things, or started to find out about these things at the NRA annual meeting in Indianapolis, when there was the blow up, so to speak, between Oliver North and Wayne LaPierre. Is that about when you started finding out about these things, or was there some other event?
Well, that's when we all started to hear the rumors of the misappropriation of funds, buying expensive suits, taking trips. You started seeing things like in the Washington Post, the New York Times, credible publications that did extensive investigation and started to reveal the allegations. But it wasn't until I actually started digging into that archive for the New York case that you begin to see the direct evidence of the conspiracies, of the retaliation against whistleblowers, the extent to which insiders at the NRA, staffers, were reporting to the audit committee and to various board members the things they were aware of directly from their job dealing with finances of the association. And so you see where this group on the board, most of them receiving massive amounts of money over the years, simply engaged in behind the scenes conversations where they arrogantly conspired to retaliate against people, to hide what they were doing. You saw things. I saw evidence of a text exchange between these board members where they said they wanted to hold their committee meetings in executive session so no one would know what they were doing. And so the more I read this, and the more I read these documents and read the depositions where they were questioned prior to trial, and of course then their trial testimony, I just became extremely angry. And on March 6th of last year, I started a Facebook page because I couldn't find anywhere else where it could occur, called Members Take Back Our NRA, in which people could get together, share information. Through that, I met a number of other people, some of them who had a very, very long history with NRA, who provided me with additional information, and we had discussions. And from that, last year, we promoted the 4 reform candidates that were elected to the board. And I also prepared a couple of resolutions that I presented in Dallas that, using Donald Trump's appearance after the members' meeting, they used to do a hard adjournment so that they wouldn't have to read those resolutions to the members in Dallas.
Yeah. So I was at the membership meeting in Dallas. It was actually the first membership meeting that I had ever attended, and it was interesting to say the least. But I want to back up, but before we get to that, just a moment. Back in 2019, I had actually been planning to purchase a life membership with the NRA, and these allegations started to come about, and I thought, I don't want to give my money to this organization if these allegations are true. And then, like you said, through this litigation, which was cast by the NRA, by Wayne LaPierre and his supporters, as basically a witch hunt and a bunch of false accusations to try to shut down the NRA, through depositions, through discovery, and ultimately through the trial, we found out that many of the allegations were actually true in terms of impropriety and improper handling of funds and the sorts of actions that you're talking about, where Wayne essentially created a buffer for himself within the board of directors to protect him and create secrecy, etc. So this wasn't just a witch hunt, right? I mean, many of these allegations turned out to be true. And then you actually testified at the trial. Can you tell us a little bit about that before we get to the discussion about the meeting in Dallas?
Well, in reading all of the transcripts, I also read transcripts of a lot of the pretrial conferences and hearings on motions and things. And back in April 6th of 2024, the NRA and the New York AG met with Judge Cohen. They presented their list of witnesses that they intended to call at the bench trial in July. And after they had all presented their witness list, he had two requests. First was he wanted to hear from a couple of nonprofit governance experts because he wanted to educate himself as to the issues involved. And I will tell people who might criticize him, if there was any friend in the court for the NRA, it was Judge Cohen. I've read numerous of his rulings. He made it very clear that he understood that the members have a First Amendment right as members of the NRA, and he was not going to take that away from them. He was also very careful to consider everything, and having read all of those decisions and having sat in his court and testified, I will tell you the man paid extreme attention to everything in that case. There were times that attorneys tried to gaslight him, and he would stop them and say, I sat through this trial, and he would actually refer to something, in some cases, 6 or 7 months prior, that came to his memory on the fly. So he was very, very engaged in the case, and I would say he was a friend of the NRA members because he stood up for them. But the other thing he wanted in that April 6th hearing was he said he wanted to hear from ordinary NRA members. He just didn't want to be flooded with 2 million letters. Apparently, I was the only NRA member, just ordinary NRA member, that had no other vested interest in this case, who knew that. And after the meeting in Dallas, I was very much upset about how they had used the time, the adjournment, to keep from reading my resolution. So I wrote to the judge, and he notified both sides that they had to figure out how I was going to appear. So the New York AG subpoenaed me and brought me to New York, and I spent about an hour in his court testifying. During that testimony, the lawyers, of course, from both sides did their dog and pony show. And then when it was all over with, he turned to me and said, Mr. Andring, I have a question for you. And he wanted to know my thoughts on the nomination and election processes and what needed to happen to somehow restore those processes to fairness and equality. And so I explained to him that I was very upset that Wayne LaPierre had used his position and his relationships with several board members to stack the nominating committee by using what they called cheat sheets. They then gave the nominating committee what they called crib sheets in one of the documents, telling them who to nominate and by virtue who not to nominate for the upcoming ballot. And for many, many years that worked because we might have 25, we would normally have 25 positions to vote for each year, as a third of the board, and they might propose 27, 28, 29 candidates, which meant that the vast majority of them who were Wayne LaPierre supporters would be reelected. And I did read one, I don't know if it was a letter or what it was that Marion Hammer had written, but she was appalled that some members of the board had gone around their manipulated process and gathered signatures from members to get themselves on the ballot and to get themselves elected to the board, where they then were placed on committees and started asking inconvenient questions that upset her and her fellow members on the board who were manipulating all this.
So you testified then during the penalty phase of the trial, right? There was the liability phase where there was a verdict, and then there was after the verdict, the judge had to decide what to do, right? What the consequences of the verdict should be. So is that when you testified then, was during the penalty phase?
Yeah, well, it's actually just the bench trial phase.
The bench trial phase.
I wouldn't say it was a penalty because his purpose was not to penalize the association. His purpose was to take the information he had on what had happened and the information he was getting from the experts on nonprofit governance, and of course, board members and officers and Doug Hamlin, and try to craft a solution to going forward so that the organization would be run properly within the guidelines of the law and the bylaws of the association. And so it wasn't I didn't see it as a penalty phase, just a bench trial where he was going to make his decision. So that's where I testified.
And it was a bench trial, and I appreciate that point. It was a bench trial to try to figure out how to fix the problems so that the organization could serve its members, right? So that the organization would be restored to a position where it would serve the interest of its membership.
Yeah, that was his focus. Very clearly, yeah. That was his focus, and he was asking very good questions. When the lawyers didn't ask questions that gave him the information he wanted, he himself took the time to ask questions and educate himself, so that he knew that he was getting the right information. I was asked about a monitor, and when I worked in corrections in Washington State, my employer was under a federal court order. We had a monitor for several years, and I did testify that my experience was largely positive. It forced the organization to do things that it probably otherwise would not have done. And I was criticized by that by some board members because I took that position, and it was a toss-up whether a monitor was necessary or not. And he came down the side that a monitor was not necessary, but he did insist that Bob Bensinger, who is the corporate compliance officer, also have basically I don't know if you call it a mentor, but somebody to assist him in trying to unravel all the things that had happened and craft a set of policies, compliance policies, and a compliance program that would correct the errors of the past. And he's done a very good job of that.
Yeah. And there were a range of possibilities that the judge could have pursued or ordered as a result of the bench trial phase. As you mentioned, he could have appointed a court-appointed monitor, but he took, in my view, what was probably the least, or one of the least restrictive possibilities in terms of reforming the NRA at least through the court. Can you tell us a little bit about what he did order, what he did decide through that bench trial phase?
Well, he did have a wide range of things he could have done. There were a number of board members, especially the individuals who've been involved in this, who feared that he would dissolve the board, or that he would remove those directors from the board. And he chose not to because they were duly elected by the membership, even though they were elected under a system that hid what they were doing. So members were not fully informed about what they'd been doing. But he did make the decision to remove those individuals from the audit committee because it was an important committee. And he also suggested that they be removed from the other governing committees of the association. The association has 40-some committees. Most of them are not governance related, but the audit, finance, legislative, executive committees, those committees do the governing of the association. And so his suggestion was that those people not be reappointed to those positions because of their past misconduct. And so that was one of the things he did that I very much agree with. And of course, we've seen over the last two election cycles, numerous of these old guard board members have not been reelected. And even in the 76 director elections, which are held at the annual meetings each year, last year we elected James Wallace as the 76th director over Joel Friedman. And this year we reelected Charles Hiltonen over Tom King. And so the membership is beginning to wake up and understand what these people did, who was responsible. And that's part of what I've been doing, is educating people on who was doing it, what they were doing, and why they should no longer be on the board. But it's going to take a couple more election cycles before the members can remove most of these people from the board. But thankfully now they are a minority.
Well, and that's a good point. Part of this is that the board is so large, so it takes a little while to weed out all of the bad apples within the board, because the entirety of the board is not all elected in one election cycle, right? They're elected in a 25 member increments. So this year, 25 were elected plus the 76, so 20, approximately 25 member increments. It can, if there are vacancies for whatever reason, that can vary. But then next year will be another 25 and 25 after that. But to replace a 76 member board, that can take a few cycles, as you say. So getting to last year, and you alluded to this, that there was the 4 for Reform effort to sort of change the composition of the board of directors. I've talked to Jeff Knox on a number of occasions. I know Phil Journey was one of the 4 for Reform, and they all 4 were elected to the board of directors last year, which I thought sent a signal that the members were starting to wake up, as you put it. But my impression from the meeting last year and from the results of the board meeting on Monday following the NRA annual meeting was that the reform, while it had a good foothold within the board of directors, didn't quite have the numbers they needed to have, let's say, a full impact or a quick impact in a way that would completely turn around the organization. The way my dad put it, and I think it's a good way to put it, is it's like an aircraft carrier. This is a massive organization with a large board, and you didn't quite have the numbers necessary to turn the ship last year. Can you tell us a little bit about last year, the significance of the election of the 4 for Reform, and how that started to change things?
Well, as you know, any journey starts with a first step. And last year, those 4 candidates were all that they could put together in a unified effort to get elected. Of those 4 candidates, 3 of them took 3 of the top 5 spots. But at the same time, the members failed to reelect 6 sitting members of the board, 2 of them past presidents. And so that sent a powerful message to that group on the board that their time is up. And of course, the ballot last year didn't have the number of candidates that the ballot this year had. It looked more like a regular ballot that had the 25 that were renominated, maybe a couple throwaways put in there just to round out the numbers. And then the 4 candidates managed to get on the ballot by petition. Members signed petitions to get them on the ballot. So what you have on the board is you have a group of directors who are basically reform-minded, and that group has been growing. You have the old guard who are used to manipulating things and getting their own way. And that's how they elected their own officers, and they chaired the committees. They controlled things. They decided who got committee assignments, and they could use that authority to retaliate against anybody who wouldn't go along with them. And then there is that third faction of the board, which I call the squishy middle, and they frustrate me from time to time because they sort of seem to look to see which way the wind is blowing to decide who they're going to go along with, trying to decide who the winner's going to be. And so they're frustrating. But more and more of that squishy middle has been moving toward the reform effort. We saw at the board meeting last year, I wasn't in attendance, but I did read the minutes. The very first vote that came up was the classic vote to go into executive session so that members and guests could not see what the board was doing. And the board voted to not go into executive session and to push any item that would normally be handled in executive session to the end of the agenda so that the people present could see what the board was doing and witness it firsthand as is intended by the bylaws. So you had the election. You had Mark Vaughn is elected as second vice president, Bill Bockenberg elected as first vice president, and then for whatever reason, and there are varying theories about how this happened, but Bob Barr got elected president. Bob is from that old guard, and as we saw over time, that he, like a lot of the board members, were in denial as to what had happened. And they denied that Wayne, the thing I heard over and over, especially in Dallas, was that Wayne LaPierre is a good guy who just made a few mistakes. And my assessment of it is quite different, that what he was doing was unethical. It was probably criminal to some extent. And what he was doing in concert with members on the board was what led the organization to be dragged into court, and all of this being put on public display, which has had a negative impact not only with the public but with members and former members. And so they should be held accountable for that. But it's difficult. It's difficult to decide how to do that. Wayne, of course, being found directly liable, the judge prohibited him from having any paid role within the NRA. He, of course, made his other decisions about board members serving on committees and things, but many of those board members are still on the board. But over the next few election cycles, it should be possible to diminish their numbers to almost nothing if the members truly want to change the organization.
In my impression, you called it the squishy middle, and I think that's a good way to put it. These people in the middle who sort of, as you said, are feeling for which way the wind is blowing. I think a lot of them have come to the reform side, as you mentioned, but I think there were some that I would call latent reformers. That is, they were people who thought that they needed reform, but I think feared retaliation if they spoke up before the balance of the board of directors changed. Do you have that perception as well? Am I perceiving that wrongly?
Well, I've talked to several of those directors. Some of them have said that they went along, they voted for Wayne, they went along because that's what everybody did. It's kind of that human thing. When the herd is moving in one direction, you move with the herd. But then after seeing the evidence and the testimony in the trial, some of them having sat in court for several days during that trial and hearing what happened, changed their mind. They felt betrayed by their fellow board members. They felt lied to by Wayne and their fellow board members. And so they gradually made the switch toward reform. And of course, after the bench trial and everything that came out, it became easier for some of them. But there were some of the newer board members, and I've talked to them, who saw what happened to Willis Lee when they removed him as first vice president and gave Charles Cotton a third term so that Willis would not be president of the association. And I think that was the moment that Willis realized that he was being played. And so they said, after they saw what Willis did, or what they did to Willis, that if they spoke up, they would get the same treatment that Timothy Knight, Sean Maloney, and Esther Schneider got when they spoke up back in 2017, 2018. And so they decided to bide their time and just quietly go along. But in the background, they were getting together as a group. It was a group of approximately 12 or 14 of them. And they sort of got together, and then they added the four for reform candidates from 2024. And so as they began to build this coalition and began to persuade some of these directors in the middle, they finally gained enough votes last year to not abuse executive session. They did manage to elect two of the three primary officers from the reform group. And they also managed to elect Doug Hamlin as executive vice president. And Doug is an excellent, excellent choice. He's been working very, very hard to move the organization forward, to reach out to former board members and former members, and trying to convince people to come back to the family and be part of the future of the organization.
I met Doug Hamlin at a local event. I'm from Southern Indiana, and he came to the Friends of the NRA event that they have here. It's actually the largest Friends of the NRA event in the country. But I was impressed that at the effort that he put into that event to get around and talk to ordinary members, trying to convince people that if you are a member to stick with the NRA, and if you're not, to come back and to join, because they're trying to clean up the NRA's act and push forward with the great talent and purpose that the NRA does have. So I was impressed by his efforts to do that, because I mean, to see the executive vice president at a local event like that was unheard of for quite some time. So I'm encouraged by Doug's leadership in that regard.
Well, Doug is a sharp contrast to Wayne LaPierre. Anybody who's been at the annual meetings for the last 20 years realized that Wayne traveled the back corridors of the venue. He always had his security. He would disappear behind the curtain and he would pop up somewhere else for a few minutes at a reception or some kind of a gathering. You never saw him wandering the vendor floor. You never saw him wandering the main corridors of the venue. He traveled in the shadows, and for good reason, because he didn't want to be confronted by members who were upset by how their money was being wasted. But Doug Hamlin is out there. Doug Hamlin will take the negative comments and criticism. He'll engage with people. You see, I saw him wandering the venues in several places, wandering the vendor floor, and he and I spoke after the meeting of members, because I wanted to impress upon him the second resolution that I had introduced about executive vice president interference in the nominating and election processes was to some degree aimed at him, because early on in the campaign this year, that Bob Barr and the two vice presidents asked him to sign a letter, which in my estimation was clearly electioneering by Bob Barr, misusing both his office and the NRA letterhead, urging people to not engage in what he considered to be negative campaigning, and which I consider to be exposing the facts of him and many of his running mates on the strong NRA slate. And so that, because of everything that Wayne LaPierre had done, and when you look at this case, everything that occurred in this case came down from his direct interference in the nominating election processes. And so I had written Doug when he signed that letter, and he was too busy to respond to me then, but I did meet with him on the vendor floor and talk to him about it, and he made it clear that he will never ever again ever interfere in any way, shape, or form in the election process, because it's not his job. His only job in the election is to fill out his ballot as a member and mail it, and then go back to whatever it was he was doing. And I believe now he understands that, and how critical it was for him to not ever again, in any way, shape, or form, engage himself in the nomination or election processes.
Yeah. And he seems like he is open to those sorts of critiques or information from members, not just basically insulating himself as Wayne LaPierre did. So I agree with you. He seems to be a great person for the job. And as you mentioned, I'm going to get back to Dallas for a moment. The four for reform were elected. The officers, the leadership of the organization were filled by several reformers, including Doug Hamlin. But nevertheless, we still had Bob Barr, John Frazier, and a number of, in non-officer positions, many people on the board still part of the old guard. So can you talk a little bit about how things have changed since last year in Dallas and leading up to the meeting in Atlanta? And then we'll talk about what happened in Atlanta.
Well, some of the change, I mean, Bob Barr as president had the appointment authority. And of course, he appointed people like to the audit committee and things that had no business being there. He did it out of habit. That's what they do. They appointed themselves out of this small group of directors. They held the chairmanships of the governing committees and a number of the positions on those. And like with the audit committee, that they added Rocky Marshall and as basically the token reformer on the audit committee, because he was vastly outvoted. And the nominating committee was the same, as that it was split 5-4, so they could renominate anybody they wanted to the ballot. So those things occurred because Bob had the ability to appoint all those committees except the nominating committee, which was elected by the board. But even at that, last year and going into this year, the finance committee has worked very, very hard to finally produce a reality-based budget. For years, they simply threw money at things and spent money as they pleased, without any concern about the impact it had on the organization and its operation. And of course, having spent well over $150 million in legal fees with the Brewer Law Firm, many programs and services at NRA headquarters were basically cut to the bone, if not completely gutted. And so a lot of people who've not renewed their membership are upset because those programs were lost. And so under Doug's leadership now, he has a budget. They watch it very, very closely. He reported on that at both the members meeting and the board meeting, so that people understand that they're closely monitoring expenditures. They're making cuts where necessary because revenues have not kept up with the predictions, and they're currently running a small deficit. But they're making adjustments as they go. They're hiring more staff. I believe 32 new staff this year, so that some of these programs will once again have resources and personnel to begin operating again, because that's why people joined the NRA. They didn't join the NRA to pay lawyers. They joined the NRA because of programs that they wanted, or services, or the defense of the Second Amendment. And so that's where the NRA is a potent force when it has membership and revenue to provide those programs and services in the defense of the Second Amendment. And that's why it's so vital. I'm a member of GOA. I've been a member of the Second Amendment Foundation because it was founded in my home state of Washington, and so I've been active with those things as well. And they're good organizations, but all of the other organizations put together are only a fraction of what the NRA is, with its 3+ million members and the resources they bring to bear on these things. So that's where Doug is focused on trying to bring the organization into reality and to put resources into the programs and services people want, so that the organization can survive for another 150 years.
I want to touch on a couple of points that you made. Number one, the budgeting issue. I was encouraged by the report that Doug Hamlin made about their budgeting efforts. And the fact is, I mean, they've continued to lose membership, they've continued to lose donations, but this is the first time I've heard the organization making significant efforts to try to rectify not only the donation issue, but also the budget issue to be commensurate, or to recognize that loss in membership and in donations. As they try to turn around, of course, the membership decline and the donation decline. And so I was encouraged by that, and I hope they can turn around the membership and donation decline. But the other thing is that, you're right. Part of the reason people quit donating is because they don't want to pay for lawyers, at least lawyers that are being paid to defend the wrongful actions of the NRA, right? If they're paying for lawyers, they should be paying for lawyers to litigate, violations of the right to keep and bear arms in court, much like what the Second Amendment Foundation and GOA do. But the other thing, and I've been encouraged by this from reformers that I've talked to, is that I feel like many, if not most, of the reformers want the NRA to be more collaborative with these other organizations like GOA, like SAF, like FPC, rather than what the NRA has historically done, at least in my perception, was defend the Second Amendment arena as sort of their turf and push out these other organizations. Do you see that within the group of reform candidates, that they want more effort to engage and collaborate in fighting for the right to keep and bear arms with these other gun rights organizations?
Well, what they're looking at is getting back to it. If you go back in the history of the association, is that the NRA and the Second Amendment Foundation were involved in several cases over the years, where they jointly pursued those lawsuits. GOA, of course, is a newer organization, but Bill Bockenberg has expressed that he wants to get involved with these other organizations to collaborate and to coordinate efforts, so that money isn't being double spent or whatever on some of these issues and cases. So there is a definite move within the board, the reform portion of the board, to actually reach out and do that. I'm a member of numerous organizations. All of them are good, but all of them do different things. None of them do everything that the NRA does, which is why the NRA is so important. And at one point, the NRA had a budget had revenues of $480 million a year. That's now been cut probably in half because of all of this, and it's bleeding membership. in the 14 months since January of last year, according to a source that I have. It's a very credible source. Is the NRA lost over 325,000 annual dues-paying members. That was the numbers have always been squishy on membership. You've always heard numbers 5 million, 6 million, but that 325,000 represented 14% of the membership of the association. So by simple math, one can figure out roughly how many members the association still has. And the vast majority of those are life members. So they aren't necessarily contributing money to the organization anymore. They paid their dues for life, and for many of them, they said that's it, and they haven't decided to contribute again. On my behalf, I wanted to be a benefactor member, so I made a decision to go ahead and do that. So I'm encouraged enough that I think that my money going to the association is going to go for the things that I want it to go for, and not be paying for lawyers in defense of misconduct. And within the board, there's a couple of movements going on. One of them, the resolution was published in the monthly magazine this month, where the board at its meeting in January in Dallas voted to pursue reimbursement of the indemnification that was given to Wayne LaPierre, because under New York state law, since he was found liable, he is not entitled to any sort of payment of his legal bills or other expenses related to that, because he engaged in misconduct. So that's a pretty easy case to pursue. Several members, even in Atlanta, I talked to people and they said, well, they aren't going to start contributing again until all the money paid to the board members is recovered. Well, if that's your benchmark, then you'll never give the association another dime, because much of that money is gone and is not recoverable. 1.6 million was paid to Dave Butts. Dave Butts is deceased. His estate, as far as I'm concerned, probably has been settled. So there's no money to collect. Marion Hammer was paid $3.6 million over a 20-year period. And likely that money is not recoverable. And several of the other board members, the same thing, were paid tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars. So using that as a benchmark for when you're going to start giving money again, it's probably unrealistic. Trying to pursue that money would cost more than you'd collect.
Yeah, and not only is it difficult to collect, it's hard to determine how much of it was for legitimate purposes versus how much was not for legitimate purposes. Those things are hard to parse out, depending on the particular person and circumstance, of course.
Exactly. And then the other movement within the board is to go over the Brewer law firm's bills. They were not properly reviewed. That tight little group on the Special Litigation Committee didn't, as from my understanding from people who are close to the matter, said they weren't even very closely scrutinized. But there is a case with a wrapper that the Brewer firm represented years ago, and when that individual challenged the billing, the bills were cut in half by the court. So there's a group on the board, reformers on the board, who want to pursue that and see how much of that money that was paid to the Brewer law firm can be recovered for use by the members.
So what I've encountered a number of life members who have been reluctant or who refrain from donating to the NRA until they see enough change to entice them to come back. What was it? Was it one thing, or when exactly did you change your mind about continuing to contribute to the NRA?
Well, I gave it serious consideration in January and decided against it after the board meeting. I wanted to see the results of the election this year. I wanted to see what the board was doing in Atlanta. And so after having seen now that we have a leadership team in Bill Bockenberg, Mark Vaughn, and Rocky Marshall, these are people with the business experience and sense to guide the organization carefully. We saw in the elections for the executive committee a resounding sweep of reform directors. In the nominating committee now looks to me like it is an actually honest nominating committee that is not going to be subject to manipulation by outside forces. And you also saw in the election for the Whittington Center, 3 of the 4 positions were reform directors who are committed to what they're doing. So I think there's a solid majority of the board now that is focused on making the decisions and doing the things that will actually move this organization forward. And then on top of it, seeing what Doug Hamlin has done in the last year, the appointments he's made at headquarters, the changes in personnel, the ideas that have come forward to rectify the mistakes of the past. And then, of course, I've spoken with Bob Mensinger many times, the chief compliance officer. Bob is very, very focused on being sure that, at least during his tenure, that the things that happened in the past will not happen again. And I've had several people. One individual, I won't reveal his name because he works for NRA, and I don't want to get him in trouble. But we talked in Atlanta, and he sat through the entire trial, heard everything that was said in that room during the jury trial. And he's worked with and seen Bob Mensinger and worked with him for this past year. And his comment about Bob Mensinger was, and I quote him, "That man has a moral compass," unquote. And so I think that, at least in the short term, the association's in good hands. My concern, and the reason I proposed the first resolution on conflicts of interest, again in Atlanta, is that as memories fade, the threat of going back to old ways is definitely there. And it is my mission, I guess, and until either it's changed or I've breathed my last breath, is I'm going to fight to have that door slammed shut and welded tight, so that the board no longer retains the ability to approve those kinds of contracts with their fellow board members. And that if in the future they decide this is an important thing for the association, that they should go back to the membership and make their case and let the members decide if it's a good practice.
So, and I want to get to your resolution here in just a moment. But so your position with respect to donating to the NRA really didn't change until the end of the NRA annual meeting and after the board meeting, when they elected the officer positions and filled the committee positions. Is that fair to say?
Well, the committees have not been appointed yet. That will be up to Bill Bockenberg to do as president. They did elect the only committees that were elected were nominating and audit, and both of those committees are now populated by people who are committed to reform and committed to moving the organization forward under what they call NRA 2.0. And so they're being very transparent in what they're doing. And in the past, we had no idea. We had no idea how many members we had. We had no idea what the board was doing oftentimes, because they did it in the executive session. We had no idea that, a lot of people said they had no idea that money was being paid to board members who, under the bylaws, are supposed to serve without salary. And so, that people were in the dark about things, and they were used to operating that way. And it's a real struggle for them for the older members of the board to adjust themselves to the idea that, in fact, they work for the members, and the members are entitled to know what's going on.
Well, frankly, it was a mystery to me how the NRA operated until the trial in New York and until some of the testimony came to light. And then, of course, I got a much better insight about how the NRA operates at the membership meeting last year. So I'm encouraged by the drive, the pursuit. Many of the board members are pursuing more transparency. And in fact, John Richardson proposed a resolution to basically create a space on the NRA website for members to be able to see what's going on in many of the NRA board meetings. So with that said, let's get back to Atlanta and talk a little bit about what happened at the most recent NRA annual meeting in Atlanta, talk about the resolutions that you proposed, and then we'll wrap up after that.
Okay.
So I know from seeing you in Dallas, we didn't actually meet, but I think your son passed out one of your resolutions in Dallas. And then, of course, I put a name to the face when I saw you again in Atlanta, and we actually met. I know you were actively engaged in trying to get people to support Charlie Hiltonen for the 76 director. And then obviously you had a couple of resolutions to propose at the membership meeting. Would you tell us a little bit about your efforts to help get Charlie Hilton elected as the 76th director, and then we'll talk about the resolutions that you proposed at the membership meeting?
Well, I over the years, these past couple of years, I've had directors come to me and say you should run for the board, and I've said no, I'm not interested. And they've asked me if I want to serve on committees, and I said if that's what the board wants, I'm available to do that. But I'm what I call myself a trench guy. I'm one of those guys crawls in the trenches, rolls up his sleeves, and does what needs to be done. So, having created the group last year on Facebook, there are several members of the organization who went to Dallas. Several of them went again to Atlanta, and so prior to that, we organized so that when the reform directors selected their candidate for the 76th director, that we were in the venue campaigning actively for that candidate. And last year we elected James Wallace by basically a 2-to-1 margin over Joel Friedman. And this year it was exactly, I think exactly within a vote, 2-to-1 margin, Charles Hilton over Tom King. And so it wasn't just me campaigning, that we had several members from the group who came and for at least portion of the days campaigned very, very hard and educated a lot of members, because unfortunately, out of the 70,000 people who were in Atlanta, only about 850 voted in that 76th director election. Of a similar number in Dallas, only about 750 voted. And so it was a matter of educating people. And I spoke to many life members, benefactor members, patron members who had no idea there was an election. They had no idea there was a 76th director. They had no idea even about a members meeting. And so I spent some time educating them. Some of them came to the members meeting. Many of them voted. And so we were able to elect one more vote onto the board for the reform movement. So that is an effort, not just myself, but of many, many members of the group who came. And instead of going down to look at the toys on the vendor floor, spent a lot of their time talking to fellow members and doing outreach to let people know what's been going on, where NRA is now headed, and trying to improve the support that the organization is getting. And that's just a commitment that I've always made to any group that I'm involved in.
So, just so people know, if they don't already, the 76th director is elected in a much different fashion than other people on the board, right? For other people on the board who are elected, they're elected by a ballot that comes in their NRA publication, whatever magazine it is that they've been receiving. The 76th director, unlike everybody else on the board, is elected at the meeting. So it's only people in attendance at the meeting who are able to vote for the 76th director, correct?
Yeah, it's some sort of quirk between the NRA bylaws and New York state law that they had to actually hold an election for at least one director at the annual meeting. So they created the 76th director position, and then anybody who's a voting member of NRA could go to the voter verification room, pick up their credentials for the members meeting, and then they would have an opportunity to vote in the election for any of the candidates who did not make who were not elected on the ballot. So it isn't just anybody gets to run for that. It's the people who were not elected on that ballot. And there were quite a few names this year because the ballot was 51 candidates instead of the usual maybe 28, 29, 30. And so people voted for their choice. And I think they sent again a resounding message that they want the organization reformed, that the people who ran the organization on the rocks no longer have a place in the organization. And that's a very clear message that they've been sending the last two election cycles.
And one other aspect to this I'd like to mention is that there was an effort by the reform people who were not elected on the ballot to make sure that a reformer was elected as a 76th director. For instance, Frank Tate was a reformer who did not get elected on the ballot, but nevertheless decided to step aside and declare that he was not intending to seek the 76th director position, so that the votes wouldn't get split between reformers, and that reformers would know, hey, go and vote for Charlie Hilton. Right. So that also took place, correct?
Well, yeah, but you had the strong NRA group who made their choice was Tom King, and then you had the reform directors made their choice, which is Charles Hiltonen. And so basically, those were the two primary candidates running. Most of the other candidates, as I looked at the counts, got like 10 or 15 or 20 votes, basically, because no one was actively campaigning on their behalf. And so basically, you had the reformers versus the old guard, and their two candidates going head to head. And in Dallas and in Atlanta, in both cases, the reform candidate won by about a 2-1 margin.
So let's get to the membership meeting and talk a little bit about what happened there. I want to get your thoughts about the meeting overall, and then also talk more in depth about the resolutions that you made.
Well, this year's meeting was different than Dallas. In Dallas, they added an item to the agenda for a hard adjournment because they knew they had the advantage with President Trump speaking in the afternoon and most of the people in the room wanting to go see him. And so they put that in there. It does not appear in the agenda in the bylaws. There's no mention of a firm adjournment time. And so last year was similar to what they've done every year, which is that's how they controlled to some degree resolutions they didn't like, is they convinced the members to approve an agenda that had a hard adjournment time so that they could run the clock out and filibuster the clock, which is what they did in Dallas. And we saw that in that spectacle of the resolution to urge the board to approve a move of the headquarters from Fairfax to Texas. And we saw in that particular debate, we saw how Charles Cotton, as president of the association, treated his fellow board members. And my opinion was, if that's how he treats them in public, I can only imagine how he treated them in private when they were in executive session or when they were in committee meetings that were closed to the members. So that was one of those spectacles, I think, that was a turning point, especially for some of those people in the middle on the board, that the members now understood how the old guard had been manipulating things, and the members weren't going to put it up with it anymore. Because in Dallas, when he started to bully Amanda Suffolk when she was speaking to that resolution, the room erupted in boos and jeers directed to him because of his behavior. So this year we saw the agenda was a clean agenda. It had no fixed adjournment time. So we didn't even have to challenge that. We were expecting to possibly have to do that. And then you saw within the meeting itself, it ran beyond the normal 2 hours. It was scheduled, and when you looked at it in the schedule, it was scheduled for a 2-hour period, 10 to 12, but it ran almost double that time. And so members were very, very interested in actually doing some things that had been almost impossible in past years. So when the resolutions were finally read, for the first time in anybody's memory, after the initial vote was taken, the hand count, someone called for a division, which is counting the paper ballot, yes or no. And so that's the first time in anybody's memory that that's happened at an NRA annual meeting. We also saw that the old guard tried their usual tactic of let's refer the resolution to the resolutions committee. That's where resolutions used to go to die. They never got a hearing. They never saw the light of day after that. But the members stood fast and said, no, we want to discuss this. We want to have a say in this. And Amanda Suffolk did propose a friendly amendment to that, urging the president to appoint me to the resolutions committee so that we could hammer out a final version of my resolution so that the board could consider it and vote to pass it. And so those are all things that we haven't seen in a very long time.
And do you intend to, I assume, do you intend to participate in that committee regarding your resolution?
That decision is up to Bill Bockenberg. It was that as the president, he has appointment authority. In the past, non-board members have not been appointed to the resolutions committee. So he's taken that under consideration, and he talked to me after the meeting, and he says, we'll talk more about that and other committee assignments that I might be interested in when he has more time. So I look forward to having a conversation with him, but that decision is up to him. If he
Okay.
decides that he wants me on that committee, I will, in fact, participate because I want to finally hammer this thing out. I don't want to have to take this directly to the members to have it put on the ballot for people to vote on. We shouldn't have to go that far. The board should step up and do its job and resolve this issue once and for all.
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit about what that resolution is. It was the first resolution that was of your resolutions that was read at the meeting, and it was a resolution meant to address conflicts of interest. Can you talk about what that resolution contains?
Well, when I looked at the court transcripts and the evidence in the trial in January of last year, February of last year, it was very obvious that Wayne LaPierre used his position as CEO of the NRA to initiate contracts with board members, specifically for the purpose of creating a core group who would engage in the conspiracies they engaged in to stack the board with more supporters and to retaliate against anybody who asked questions or called for audits or investigations of what he was doing. So that particular situation to me is absolutely outrageous. That presumably these people who run for the board are volunteers. They're unpaid volunteers. They're entitled to be reimbursed for their expenses for travel on behalf of the NRA. And that would be not only just to board meetings, but if the board sends them off to make a speech or make an appearance with some group or some event, then they're entitled to be reimbursed for their actual costs. But they are not entitled to receive a salary or some kind of financial reward for doing that. And so these people ran on the basis that they were volunteers. And if they're unhappy with having to do these things without being paid, then my only answer is then resign and let somebody else who wants to do it take your place. And so I've built this resolution around the idea. I kicked around a number of different versions. I had some attorneys look at it. I talked with some other people with long experience with the NRA, and I've tried to fine tune it so that it works from the NRA's side, that the NRA is not able to engage in these kinds of contracts or financial transactions with board members, their family members, outside organizations these people are involved in. And part of the corporate compliance program that Bob Mensinger is working with is they have to do financial disclosures. And even as things change, they're required to immediately make those changes known to him and corporate counsel so that NRA can decide whether or not a particular contract is in compliance with that conflict of interest policy. And it is a very good policy. I've read it, and Bob Mensinger sent me the most recent version of it. I've reviewed it. It's a very good policy, and my only qualm about it is that it does not absolutely forbid board members from engaging in these kinds of contracts, because it is these contracts that Wayne LaPierre used as a carrot to get the group of board members to coalesce around him, to protect him, to turn a blind eye to what he was doing, in some cases to participate with him in it, and to retaliate against anybody who threatened that. And so having board members who are truly independent, who make their money somewhere else and are not dependent on the NRA for their livelihood, means that they can be independent and they can make decisions in the best interest of the members, because in the end, they work for the members. They don't work for themselves. They don't work for the executive vice president. They don't work for the NRA. They work for the members.
So you made this resolution to prevent these conflicts of interest that have plagued the NRA in the past. And as you alluded to earlier, there was a motion to refer this resolution to the bylaws committee, I believe, and there was a vote on the motion to refer it to committee, and you got up and spoke, and I thought you did very well in speaking and in advocating for arguing for the resolution, but also in arguing against the motion to refer it to the committee, saying exactly that, hey, this committees is where these sorts of things go to die. And then Amanda Suffolcool made the motion to amend the motion to refer to committee by proposing that you be added to the committee. or be part of the committee. And that became part of this vote. Amanda's motion to amend, the motion to refer, there was a vote, and it was a hand vote by showing the ballots in the air, and it was very close. And then there was a request for a paper ballot, and I think you mentioned earlier this is the first time that that's been done, and I don't know. It certainly didn't happen last year, but it's my understanding that's the first time that had happened in a long time.
Well, that's what people tell me. I've been going to members meetings since I think 2018 was the first one I went to. I didn't make it to some of the NRA annual meetings, but I've been to several of them, and it's always been hold up your credentials. They did a hand count, and it said either it passed or it failed. There was also the tactic by previous presidents who simply declared the resolutions out of order. And so there was never any discussion. There was never a vote. There was never anything. And so in Dallas last year, they ran the clock out. But the resolution did end up, because it had been submitted, it was referred to the Resolutions Committee, where the Resolutions Committee voted it down. And then that was in the September board meeting in Dallas. And then at the January meeting, Jeff Knox and Dennis Fusaro asked for it to be put back on the agenda, which under the bylaws they can do. So it was a formal agenda item. And the resolution was presented to the board, and the board voted it down again. And so my position in responding to this resolution to refer to the Resolutions Committee is it's already been referred. It's already been voted on by the board. And so now it's time for the members to speak and say, we want this resolution to be passed. But like any human endeavors, it probably has a couple of flaws in it. And so I was perfectly willing to allow the resolution to be referred back to the Resolution Committee. And if the president chooses to put me on that committee so we can hammer out the final details and get this into a form where we can get it passed, I'm perfectly acceptable of that.
And of course, at the time of the membership meeting, part of the problem is we didn't know who the president was going to be and who would be, selecting the committees. Now, of course, we know that it's a reformer, so that's good news. But one question I have is that, what did you think about the way that former President Barr conducted the meeting? I thought he was far better, of course, than Charles Cotton in what he did last year in Dallas. But the only point at which, in the meeting at which I thought there was some sleight of hand was when the person requested the paper vote, because of the way they were making the request. Did you perceive that, or do you have any other thoughts about the way he conducted the meeting?
That particular issue was simply a matter of confusion. That under Robert's Rules of Order, that a person comes to the microphone and makes a motion for a division. That's the formal term for having a vote of the yeas and the nays, so you can determine whether or not a resolution passed or failed. Phil Journey did come to the microphone, and I don't think people were paying attention to him, and reminded the group that the actual term was not what the member was calling for was a roll call, which there is no place in Robert's Rules of Order for a roll call, and the proper term was a division. And so Bob Barr was attempting to clarify that and determine whether, in fact, that's what the person wanted. So finally, when that individual understood that the proper request is a motion for a division, then Bob Barr proceeded that way. And I thought Bob ran a very, very good meeting. That he's very good at running meetings in concert with the parliamentarian, and so I applaud him for that. My criticism of Bob Barr was his choices for committees when he appointed his committees, and also his continued insistence that, despite what the jury said in its verdict, and the very first count in their verdict was that the NRA failed to properly administer the assets of the organization for the benefit of the members. And he, like Charles Cotton before him, continued to deny that NRA had done anything wrong. Yeah. Because if they were to admit that NRA did anything wrong, they would also have to admit that they and their fellow board members had failed the membership. And I think that's one of those hurdles they just can't bring themselves to get over. I was talking with Tom King during the campaign for the 76 director election. And in previous years, the excuse for everything was that it was Letitia James and Michael Bloomberg. And every old guard director I spoke to, those were the words that came out of their mouth. This year, and I heard it from several others, the new excuse is that podcasters and bloggers are spreading lies and disinformation because they just can't bring themselves to admit that not only did Wayne LaPierre make mistakes and some rather huge mistakes, but they made mistakes as well. They can't bring themselves to admit it and apologize to the members for what they've done.
I agree with you completely. I thought that Bob Barr did an admirable job running the meeting, but like you say, he just can't get himself to get over that hurdle of acknowledging wrongdoing, acknowledging the mistakes, and advocating for the change required to fix those mistakes going forward. And part of the problem too is that from a practical standpoint, that acknowledging those mistakes is, I think, what's required to restore trust in the membership. And people, I think, are privy to this sort of hand waving or distraction, that they're trying to blame everything on the Attorney General or Letitia James, and that people want to hear the NRA acknowledge the problems that they've had and talk about how they're fixing them before they start coming back and giving their money to the NRA.
One of the things, and I've talked to several people in Atlanta, I've talked to several people in the group and also in Dallas last year, is what's happened is that we had the trial and people sort of put a stop there and said, okay, that's the past. And then all of a sudden in Dallas last year, they launched NRA 2.0 and they want to take off like a drag racer. And the piece that's missing between those is, I believe that the board and the officers need to stand up and make a full-throated apology to the membership because the board failed. Now the officers, Mark Vaughn and Rocky Marshall was one of the reform directors who was pushed off after his first term because he was asking uncomfortable questions. And so those people need to stand up and say, we failed you. We're acknowledging that we failed you. For those of you who left in anger, your anger was well-founded. And then from that point on, if you want to then say, now this is what we're doing from here forward. A lot of people have simply said they want an apology and they haven't gotten one. And if they're waiting for an apology from the old guard directors, it's never going to happen. They will never admit that they were somehow responsible for what happened. They can't bring themselves to do that. But one of the things that I'm going to talk to Bill Bockenberg about is an idea that Doug Hamlin brought up at the members meeting, the directors meeting in Dallas last September. I attended the membership meeting, which is the first time that the membership committee had met in about 5 years. And Doug came into the meeting and sat down with us and told us how bad the membership losses were. That he was talking specifically about that at its peak, NRA had 1,600 local associations and clubs that were part of the NRA, and that number had dwindled to about 800. And so his suggestion at that meeting was that each of the directors should take 10 clubs or associations near their homes and go make personal visits to talk to those clubs and to listen to what they have to say and bring that information back. And so when I talked to Bill, and we're going to have a further conversation of this, is I'm not a board member, I'm not an employee of NRA, but I am willing to go make visits to some of those associations and to apologize to them for what happened, to acknowledge that their anger is well-founded, and to tell them what NRA is doing now so that this never happens again. And then if they choose to reaffiliate with NRA, terrific. And if not, I understand that.
Well, and I think that your resolution would go a long way to helping provide some trust and some comfort to those clubs to come back, because the conflict of interest, the conflicts of interest that were pervasive before, I think, would be largely addressed in the future by adopting your resolution, and maybe with some slight modifications. I know that David Rainey, a history professor from Hillsdale College, expressed some concern about basically the breadth of it, because he's a professor at Hillsdale, and Hillsdale receives some grants or funding from the NRA for their programs, and that might be seen as some sort of conflict of interest because he gets paid by Hillsdale, etc. So maybe those sorts of issues can be hashed out. I'm not sure, but nevertheless, I hope that something close to what you've proposed here in this resolution is adopted, because I think it would go a long way if the board of directors going to those clubs or associations could show them that this is part of our bylaws now, that these conflicts of interest can't happen.
Yeah. Well, they can go with NRA's conflict of interest policy now and share that information.
Mm-hmm.
My resolution is aimed at the long term, when memories start to fade.
Right.
People start to think, well, maybe we can cleverly start this all over again and nobody will notice. I want to be certain that cannot be the case. And so from here going forward, that board members serve as volunteers, strictly as volunteers, and that they're not. When you look at all of the stuff that's gone on in the 20 years from 2004 to 2023, board members received $8,932,088 in direct cash payments. But then additional monies were sent to, like, the American Conservative Union and to the Washington Times, where a former president was employed as the op-ed editor, and things like that. There's a number of those things when you go through the trial evidence, where money was directed to people where it somehow, I believe, in some cases, found its way back in their pockets through surreptitious means. And the problem which you have when you start sending NRA money to third entities is we can't track where it goes once it leaves the bank account, because we can't audit other entities. And so in my estimation, it needs to be that those entities don't get money, period. And that way you don't have to worry about whether or not it's finding its way back into a board member's pocket.
Well, I hope that your resolution, like I said, your conflict of interest resolution is passed in some form. And it was ultimately, after the paper vote, after the division, referred to committee, and hopefully Bill Bockenberg sees fit to include you in that process. And I think that including you in that process would be a very wise decision. So let's talk a little bit about what else happened at the meeting. I know you had another resolution. John Richardson had a resolution. And then I want to talk, sort of conclude with your thoughts about what happened at the board of directors meeting on Monday.
Well, we had some very good discussions at the members' meeting, something that has not happened in any of the members' meetings I've ever attended. They were in the years prior to the allegations coming out, they were dog and pony shows, where Wayne LaPierre with Ackerman McQueen's assistance with some high-end video stuff and audio-visual presentations, basically was I would say a circus performer. And so that's what meetings were like. But those meetings would be attended by 4,000 or 5,000 people. Then after the allegations started coming out, then you saw in Houston, in Dallas, or in Houston, there were probably 400 or 500 people showed up. And there were a number of resolutions presented about, investigating Wayne LaPierre, calling for his resignation, those calling for audits. And all of those resolutions were simply ruled out of order by the chair. And so there was no discussion. So this year's meeting, I think, is a benchmark now for what meetings are going to be, at least in the near term, where members are going to have some real issues to discuss. They're going to have some input. I mean, there was a very rousing discussion about John Richardson's resolution, which was simply to create a member portal so that members could, for example, get a current copy of the bylaws. Under the bylaws now, you have to write to the secretary, you have to provide a self-addressed stamped envelope, and then they'll mail you a copy of the bylaws. That's ridiculous in this age, where people should be able to go and see the updated bylaws, because they can be changed at a board of directors meeting through a process that's also included, that's different from the members voting a change in the bylaws. And so with the 3 meetings a year, that between the annual meetings, you may have a change in September or in January when they meet. So this is where members can get that information updated, as well as, to the degree possible. I don't think they want to put out the financials to the public, but they certainly could create some kind of a portal that voting members could log into and get this information. You're also seeing they're doing a trial run now in compliance with the judge's wishes in his final decision, that directors can now seek petition signatures electronically. Amanda Suffolk she's their quote guinea pig to test the system, see how it works, and I've logged in and signed her petition for next year. And also Todd Figert is working on his. Todd Vandermine has got his portal up and working again. So I visited and signed those petitions. So in addition to just the old paper process, people can now do it electronically, which indicates to me that from here on out, ballots for directors will be sizable, probably much greater even than 50 or 51 candidates. Might be as many as 75, because it's going to be easier for a candidate to gain those signatures. So these are processes that can use technology, which can cut down costs. And at some point, I think there's going to be an effort to do voting in the board elections electronically, and hopefully get the number of members responding to the ballots up from 75, 78, 80,000 up to, perhaps, 200,000 or 300,000 or even 500,000. That would be a truly good thing for the organization, because people will then be involved and they will have a stake then in how things occurred. When you look at, when people start pointing fingers, one of the fingers we have to point at ourselves as members is we elected these people to the board. And so we allowed the nominating process to be limited. We allowed the ballot to be limited. And we elected these people, and we didn't speak up and say, we need somebody else. We don't like what's going on. So that's part of what allowed this group to coalesce and to engage in these conspiracies and to manipulate things to their benefit and the benefit of Wayne LaPierre and his cronies.
And I think that the electronic balloting makes a lot of sense for a number of reasons. Number one, as you mentioned, it allows more members to engage more easily, and you get more membership feedback. It also helps prevent situations where someone like Wayne LaPierre might try to insulate himself through the nominating process. I think it helps reduce the chances of that happening. And then finally, it also, I think, helps engage the younger members because many of the younger members don't care about the magazine, don't care about the print. They want to see what's online, what's on their phone, what's on their computer. And so I think that the electronic balloting can be beneficial for all of those reasons. So I guess, do you agree with that, or do you see other benefits as well?
Well, I think it, in this day and age, people are now geared toward the electronic. That's what they're used to. That's what they're most comfortable with. And so, and I mean, a postage stamp now costs what, 75, 80 cents? Nobody wants to spend that money. A lot of people don't even have postage stamps. And so they just do everything electronically. So by adding that as a component, you can still, being able to vote by paper or to vote electronically, you can have your voice heard, and it makes it more convenient for people to do it. And so hopefully that will induce more people to become involved, because one of the problems we've had over the last 25, 30 years is that a lot of members just were not involved. They didn't attend the annual meetings. They had no idea what the board was doing. They weren't involved in committees. And one of the things I would like to see, and I will urge anybody who is a member of NRA and you have some interest in one of the non-governing committees, the shooting sports committees or hunting committees, or there's a whole host of those committees, is let Bill Bockenberg know you have an interest in that and that you would like to participate in that committee process, because he can certainly appoint to the committees whoever he wishes. He can appoint as many people as he wishes. And so if you're a shooting sports enthusiast or a hunting enthusiast and you want to be involved in this process of, steering the NRA's programs with regard to those things, then let the president know. Bill Bockenberg is now, whoever the future presidents are, let them know of your interest. Because I introduced a couple of people at the board meeting to the officers and said, these individuals want to become more involved. And they gave them their information. And so we'll see what Bill decides to do with that. But that's how you become involved in the NRA. You become more active. You become more active as an interface between your local club or your local shooting range or whatever and what the NRA is doing. And that's how you build a stronger NRA.
So I want to get to, before we close up here, we're coming up on close to an hour and a half. I want to talk a little bit about what your impressions were from the board meeting on Monday at the end of the NRA annual meeting, and then any parting thoughts that you might have about the future of the NRA.
Well, the NRA is definitely still in dangerous territory. It cannot continue to shed hundreds of thousands of members every year. It can't continue to shed clubs. It can't continue to shed donors because it requires money to make these things work. But I think at this point, having seen what happened at the board meeting and seeing the votes, seeing the direction that the majority of the board now wishes to go, is that a very clear message has been sent to the old guard that their time is up, and it's simply time for them to step aside and let a new generation of directors move the organization forward, support Doug Hamlin and what he's doing, support the programs and the services and the Second Amendment defense and all of those things. And if we can start to regain membership and increase donations with that larger budget, they can do more support for programs. It's kind of, if you're waiting for the program to be fully up and operational where it was 6-7 years ago, you're never going to rejoin. It's your rejoining that gives them the money to hire the staff, to get the technology or the resources necessary to build these programs up. And so I would certainly encourage all of my brothers and sisters who were members of the association. I think now it's time to come home, and you'll be welcomed with open arms. And I think that you can trust the board because the board is now operating with far better integrity, far better transparency, and far better accountability for what the organization is doing from here forward.
I completely agree. I was reluctant to encourage anybody to become members if they weren't already members, or to renew their membership, or give money to the NRA. Prior to this meeting, I wanted to see how things went during the NRA annual meeting, both at the membership meeting and at the board of directors meeting. And I, like you, am optimistic that the NRA is back on a good path going forward. So I hope that people will consider rejoining, and I think that they won't be disappointed, and especially if they are engaged, as you are and as many other members are starting to become more engaged. So, Ron, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the Forge of Freedom. Do you have any other parting thoughts before we close up this episode?
Well, basically just asking people who were previous members to consider coming back, people who thought about it in the past but didn't because of what happened in the past, to reconsider their decision and join, because the entire 2A community, the shooting sports community, is stronger with a strong NRA in cooperation with the other organizations like Gun Owners of America, Second Amendment Foundation, working in coordination to defend our rights, but also to provide services, to train trainers, to do all those things that the NRA does that the other organizations aren't doing, at least yet, so that we have a place to shoot. We have good instruction for those who need instruction, and that we have a good defense for the Second Amendment.
Well, Ron, I really like I said, I really appreciate you joining the show. We mentioned Members Take Back Our NRA, the Facebook page that you started. Are there other resources that you would point people to stay up to date with what's going on at the NRA?
Well, the NRA there is some sort of a members portal exists already. If you are a member, you'll get a magazine from the NRA. You're seeing now board members are insisting that some of these important decisions are published in the magazines so that members know what's going on. Um, you have also, there's resources like NRA in Danger, which was a source of information. The Friends of the Second Amendment is a Facebook group, or a group, I think it's a Facebook group, that was doing some reporting. And you got John Richardson's Only Guns and Money site, where he over the years has been posting a lot of this information, so that not now going forward is not going to be a lot of what happened in the past. Now it's going to be information that's going to let people know what the organization is doing, how it is moving forward, how it is being transparent and accountable for the things it's doing, and give people an opportunity to. My page is basically exists because I couldn't find any place where people could just have a discussion, where they could post information they knew, ask questions, or discuss issues. And that's the only reason I created the page. And so
Well,
that's why it exists.
yeah, and I'm glad that you did. I joined shortly after you started the page, and it's been a great resource to for people to connect to find out what's going on at the NRA. And so I think it's been a great resource, and I thank you for starting that endeavor.
And I would also encourage people to join your your official state affiliate of the NRA. I'm also a life member of the Texas State Rifle Association. Each state has a particular organization, and so that's where at a local level, where you can serve your state association and also partner with them and the NRA to both get the programs and services that you're looking for, but also be able to volunteer and contribute to what they're doing to help grow both of those associations.
Well, thank you, Ron, for joining the Forge of Freedom. I really appreciate your time today, and thank you, everyone, for tuning in. If you enjoyed the episode, if you got something from it, don't forget to like and subscribe to help us spread the message of freedom. As always, you can find the episodes on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, and X at Forge of Freedom and all the most popular podcasting platforms. And you can also find us at forgeoffreedom.com. Until next time, everybody, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.